whispering in Claire's ear?
They were sweet nothings.
I know, but
I miss them all.
Okay, so I'm going to pass packets around, and they're stacked so that it's self-explanatory. There's a bunch of stuff, and you just want to take one packet. What I'm going to do is wing through what some of you, what's become a ritual for some of you, which is my brief introduction to Levinas. Each year it does get a little briefer, a little more concise, but for those of you who don't know who this guy is there someone who doesn't know and needs to know more? Okay.
Good.
All right, so this is going to be a quickie. It's going to be a whirlwind tour. Okay. Emmanuel Levinas lived from 1906 to 1995. So he really was a quintessential 20th century philosopher. He was a French Litvak, born in Lithuania, studied, was very influenced in his study by the Vilna Gaon. His approach to Talmud tended to be very, very rational, very much in the Musar ethical tradition. And he moved to France, where he studied Western philosophy. The French in 1923, which is significant historically. Levinas studied with Edmund Husserl, who founded a branch of philosophy which we call phenomenology. Phenomenology is a disciplined study of consciousness from a first-person perspective. How do human beings perceive, experience, relate to phenomena? And Levinas was well on his way. He was translating Husserl from German into French. He had a career as a bright young man ahead of him. And then World War II happened. Levinas survived the war as a prisoner of war. He joined the French army. He was a soldier. However, his parents were murdered in the camps, as were many of his relatives. His wife and children, however, were saved thanks to the heroic efforts of French Catholics who hid them. So he, in his biography, was in some ways paradigmatic of the Jewish experience in Europe at the time in many, many ways. If you're a student of philosophy and you want to place him ideologically, he was a student of Husserl, he was a contemporary of Martin Heidegger, he was a teacher of Jacques Derrida. So Levinas is on the cusp of what preceded postmodernism and a more traditional approach to Western philosophy, and a critique which he helped to found and lead following World War II, and asking some of the questions that we found ourselves asking after we saw the film with which we began our gathering. How did this happen? Particularly, how did this happen in a country that prided itself on being a kind of home of some of the best philosophical traditions of the West? So, what's wrong, maybe, with the philosophical traditions of the West? So, from within that tradition, Levinas launched a critique, and he had two great projects throughout the rest of his life. And one was from within the study of philosophy as a discipline, asking these questions. How did this happen? And very pointedly, how did his colleague and contemporary, the brilliant Martin Heidegger, become one of those intellectuals whom we considered the other night, who lent his name, his prestige, and all of his intellectual might to the project of Nazism? How could this be? The other great project that Levinas initiated and that we're part of today is a movement on the part of Western-born, relatively assimilated Jewish people, intellectuals, or at least people who pursue education, back to traditional Jewish learning, back to Talmud, back to Talmud Torah, back to the Midrashim. And it was Levinas' position that this is a whole self-grounded, integral way of knowing, as complex as interesting, as illuminating of the human condition as Western philosophy. In point of fact, with regard to its history, grew up kind of in counterposition, in a constant creative tension with Hellenistic thought, and urged Jews like us, the whole range of what like us means, urged Jews like us to learn Hebrew, to reclaim our scriptures, to reclaim the exegetical traditions that are particular to Judaism and the ways of considering knowledge that are particular to Judaism, that we can't get anywhere else, as ways of learning how to be in the world, how to live, and how to think about stuff. This is to say, Levinas based his critique of Western philosophy on the following observations. The great beginning of Western philosophy, and he founded this on a critique of its greatest thinker, Plato, his disciple Aristotle, the people who came after, was a reliance on reason, on the reasoned distance contemplation of the world. And an assumption that if the thinker is in possession of his or her faculties, if all thinkers are, then reason is going to lead you and I and everyone here to the same conclusion about whatever it is that we're considering. And that the proper attitude is distance, that one seeks to illumine, one seeks to cast light on, and one seeks to contemplate and to assimilate into everything one knows. Now, in the history of Western thought, there was a reaction to this. After we had the Western Enlightenment, was a reclamation of reason and a corrective to what many people saw as an extreme domination of public thought by religion. We had the Romantic movement, which privileged the extra-rational aspects of consciousness. It privileged the individual epiphany. It privileged intuition. It privileged what happens when we get out by ourselves within nature and are open to what the Romantics believed were the kind of universal emanations of all that is within the human soul. And if you want to see an American example of that, you can look to Emerson, who talked about the oversoul, with which one is most easily in touch out in the country by oneself. And at that point, one becomes alive to this kind of truer self, which is connected to all living things. Well, Emerson only preceded Friedrich Nietzsche by 50 years. It was a huge influence on him. And even though people say what followed was a colossal misreading of Nietzsche, aspects of his thought were a huge influence on the Nazis because of this German Romanticism. Remember that the film that we saw referenced this notion of the book, of a kind of essentialized being, a kind of romance of the land. You know, there were all these long shots of the German landscape, of the particularly German hills and dales and forests. And there was a kind of ideological position that these things, this landscape, that actually shaped and animated the German soul in a fundamental way that nobody else could understand. And we saw what that gave rise to. What Levinas came to his conclusion is that what the extreme rationalism and extreme romanticism have in common is a privileging of the ego, a privileging of the I. Because in both cases, in both attitudes, what we have is a domestication of all that we perceive and all that we cast our gaze upon into the self, or as Levinas put it, a domestication of the other into the same. Either I encompass the world in my realm of understanding, I domesticate it into an object of knowledge, something that I can figure out in my head, or I attempt to merge with the all in a kind of ecstatic oneness. But he says phenomenologically, really, that's me throwing my ecstatic trip around whatever it is that I perceive and subsuming it into my consciousness. And in either case, what he calls this is totality. And the active verb is totalization. What the West seeks to do is totalize, to either create a grand story, a grand narrative, a grand political system, the Roman Empire, which sought to extend itself as far as it possibly could, because it considered itself to be the embodiment of rational statecraft. Or this romantic ecstasy in which the entire universe becomes the ground for the movement of my soul. And if my soul happens to be primordially violent, well, you know, that's authentic, that's honest. That kind of violence is good, and it feels good. Levinas tended to lead away in philosophical thinking from what he considered to be the West's privileging of ontology and epistemology. What is real, and how do we know it? What is true? To a privileging of relationship. In place of this movement to domesticate the other into the same, Levinas said that the fundamental of the human is encountering the other, meaning the other human, actual human being. And, you know, we see this reflected in, I wish Carol was here, we see this reflected in some of the insights of psychoanalysis. And the point being that one only extrudes a self